Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Here is the book in question, The Truth About Magic. And I'd also like to point out to you that this book is also available in an audio and video series with essentially the same content on Vimeo. So you can track the book on Amazon and order the audio and video series on Vimeo, depending on your preference, of course. So tonight's topic is the truth about magic. And of course, I don't know the whole truth about magic. Nobody does. I don't know the whole truth about anything. But I am willing to say a little bit about the subject without too much superstitious nonsense or without too much snide skepticism or debunking. Let me further add that when I talk about magic, I am not talking about sleight of hand magic of the type where you pull a quarter out of a little boy's ear, or you have this enormous stage show in Vegas with sounds and lights and all sorts of wonderful effects. That is sleight of hand magic, stage magic. I admire the people who do it enormously. I have no idea how to do it myself. I am not going to be talking about it. I'm going to be talking about what is often called occult magic. And I will start by going back to 1890, when the scholar J.G. Frazer, author of the classic work, The Golden Bough, first published that work. And he essentially divided human religious experience into three categories. One was magic. That is to say, you were using these ritual methods, chants, amulets, to manipulate these unseen forces to achieve certain ends. It was pretty much a cause and effect relation. According to Frazer, this didn't work. So instead of attempting to manipulate or command these forces, humans got the idea that they should start asking them nicely, if not begging them. And that, Frazer said, was the origin of religion. Religion, he said, was a confession of human impotence. Now, Frazer was a good Victorian, and like every good Victorian, he believed that science had the answer to everything. So, of course, he took the third stage to be science, as we know it today, or some version of what we know it today. It was going to provide all the answers. I would like to respectfully submit to you that that is not the case, and that it is more obviously not the case on a day-to-day basis. But that is a subject for another lecture. In any case, these things are not as easily separated as Frazer might have wanted us to think. In fact, in the 1920s, there was a scholar named Lynn Thorndike who published a monumental work called The History of Magic and Experimental Science. And this work, in several volumes, occupies about this much of a shelf. And as a result, we can say that magic and science at least bore into each other. So we can set aside all of these arbitrary concepts of magic was one primitive stage, religion kind of came next, and now, of course, we have the truth as codified by the laws of physics or whatever. In fact, magic is practiced all around the world. It has been practiced all around the world for as anyone knows, for as long as anyone has been able to keep any record and beyond. Because primitive artifacts suggest that these objects may have had a magical function. Of course, when you're dealing with people who didn't leave you any writings, you're speculating. They didn't write anything, so you just draw up a theory, and of course you attempt to convince everybody that that's the truth, and that's what academic scholarship is, another subject I will, fortunately for you, not go into tonight. Nevertheless, magic has been practiced. And this leads us to the most obvious question about magic. Well, the most obvious question about magic is, what is it? Well, in this context, it is attempting to cause effects in the world through, shall we say, unseen causes, or causes that are not normally considered to be part of the physical world. Switching on a light with a switch in the corner is not magic. But attempting to do things ranging from, well, let's say you're not a very ethical person, to get someone to fall in love with you. Maybe you, and this was done in rural times, maybe you didn't like the people over the hill, so you would do something to cause their cows to dry up, which may sound kind of funny now, but this was not a time when you went to the store and got milk for $2.69 a gallon. This was your livelihood, if not your life. So people did this. They did magic for both good and for bad. Did it work? Well, we have one answer in the fact that this has been done continually throughout human history, as I've already said. Well, then you might want to say, if magic works so well, why doesn't everybody do it now? And I will give again a very simple and clear answer to that, because it is almost impossible to do these kinds of things without unintended and undesired consequences. I had a friend years ago who had a boyfriend who was starting a business. For this business, he needed $10,000. So she did a magical working of some kind to get him this $10,000. Well, it just so happened that she was finishing medical school at this point, and she was moving out of her dorm, and she had all of her belongings loaded into her car, and somebody broke into the car and stole them. And the insurance settlement was, guess what? $10,000. So did it work? Yeah. Did a lot of things happen to make it work that maybe she didn't really want? Yeah. And that is always a rather fraught issue in the world of magic. So I'm suggesting to you that these things can work and do work under certain circumstances, but with very, very unpredictable side effects. As a result, many people have chosen to steer clear of them. It's basically like teenagers. How many teenagers have you known, or I know, who, yeah, let's get this magic kind of teen Wicca stuff. This sounds kind of cool. Let's do that. So they try something. And then, oh my God, it works. And the smart ones are just terrified and say, I'm not touching this stuff again. The stupid ones say, wow, let's see what we can do this. The really smart ones say, you know, I may not want to play with this stuff, but this does point to realities that the world around me isn't telling me about, and maybe I should look into those. So that, in a sense, is magic and whether it works. And we can divide magic into a few categories, maybe an almost infinite number of categories. But one very common one has to do with working with spirits. That is to say, creatures who exist in the world around us, but we do not normally see or perceive with our senses. Of course, again, to the rationalistic mind, this sounds ridiculous. But let's go back to science for a minute. There is an enormous electromagnetic spectrum, ranging from low sound waves to cosmic waves or whatever. Our persight can see like a little bandwidth of this. Our hearing can perceive another little bandwidth of this. So there is a whole continuum of reality that our senses are not set up to perceive. Some scientists these days argue that, well, it's a matter of evolution. We develop these senses as they are to focus on survival. That may be or may not be, but our 5 familiar senses do not encompass the whole world. We've kind of, well, yeah, there are microscopes and telescopes, and we've pushed the boundaries a little bit, but we have no reason to believe we've pushed them totally. I would also suggest that these other realities can be perceived by us, except not with the familiar senses. These are with senses that we don't know a great deal about, because for at least the last 200 years, the intellectual authorities have been insisting that there were no such thing. I'm talking about things like psychokinesis, that is moving things from a distance, telepathy, that is communicating mentally across a distance, clairvoyance, seeing something from a distance, or possibly seeing things like auras in people. I do know people who can do that. It's an extremely rare skill, and most of the people I've known who've had it were simply born with it. Maybe they got a little training on the way. But I would also suggest that we have these senses in ourselves, and the reason we haven't developed them is that we've been told we don't have them. If someone told you from your childhood, and everyone in your society believed that there was no such thing as pianos, much less the ability to play the piano, well, guess what? Nobody would know how to play the piano. And I suggest we're dealing with something similar to that here. I did mention clairvoyance, and I want to make a little point about that. Clairvoyants see things that people don't see ordinarily. My personal view is that most people have psychic powers, but they're not expressed in the ways I've just described. They are kinesthetic, meaning in this sense that they have to do with a felt sense. If you go into a creepy old house, you may not see ghosts and demons, maybe nothing visible. But this place gives me the creeps. I just don't like it here. I love the beginning of every horror movie, you know. This couple is like looking through this old sinister house, you know, there's, you know, dark substances dripping from the ceiling, and, you know, the wife says to the husband, honey, this place gives me the creeps. And he says, yeah, me too, let's make an offer. You know, otherwise the movie wouldn't happen. But as you know, horror movies are basically predicated on every character doing the least rational and least sensible thing in any given set of circumstances. Let's hope that doesn't strain your credulity too much. But people have these senses on a regular basis. You know, people have good feelings and bad feelings about people, about places, about things. And usually they find, not that these are infallible, but they do find that this is an important source of information that you neglect at your own peril. That is to say, the place gives you the creeps. Well, gee, it's $200,000 cheaper than every other place on the market of, you know, comparable size. Well, I guess you have to factor all that in. But if you don't factor in that kind of kinesthetic felt sense, this just doesn't feel good to me, you're probably going to make some kind of mistake. And of course, the reason people love their animals, their pet animals, so much is that animals have much fewer filters against this. You know, the dog really doesn't like that person. The cat really doesn't like that person. And you get a sense that, yeah, they're not infallible either. but you get a sense that they're picking up on something that you may not be picking up on. So that is kind of the background of the kind of powers that I believe we have, whether we want to admit them or not, or whether we want to cultivate them or not. And magic would be to say, well, let's say there are these entities out there whom we can perceive in some sort of way. Perhaps we can interact with them. And this is the basis of the oldest and most universal of all human religions, which is shamanism. Shamanism is not an established religion like the Roman Catholic Church. It has no sacred texts or books. Nonetheless, it has been practiced, again, universally. And as far as we can tell, since time immemorial. And a great deal of shamanic practice has to do with, through various methods, psychically entering other realms, interacting with beings there for purposes such as healing, or maybe for not such good purposes. And a relationship with the spirits is an important part of this process. One common form of shamanism, which is kind of a distilled version from, which is called Michael Harner's core shamanism. Well, and you can do workshops on this. You'll go and you'll actually make contact with the, shall we say, essence of a particular type of animal, which then becomes your power animal, which gives you certain qualities, powers, and attributes that you might not otherwise have had. That's at one level. At another level, you contact spirits of a higher sort who are kind of paternal, guardian, guiding spirits. And if you want some help or you want some information about something, you consult them. So shamanism is very, very much about this encounter with the unseen worlds. And again, it has very, very palpable effects. Shamans will often perform medical cures that medical science wasn't able to do. A lot of times people go to these sources like shamans only after all the conventional medical means failed. Most of the people I've known who've done this sort of thing didn't do it because they were superstitious and didn't trust the doctors and hospitals. They did this very often as a last resort. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But that means also that a lot of the most advanced, sophisticated medical techniques and medicines don't always work either. A thing which I suspect you did not just learn from me right now. So this is one thing. You interact with the spirits in some kind of ways, ritual ways. It usually involves some withdrawal from the ordinary world as we know it. And again, a major feature of the sacred in all traditions, including but not limited to the shamanic, is this break, this separation between the worlds of the sacred and the profane. And in order to make these kinds of contacts, you isolate yourself from the profane, ordinary world. How do you do this? In many cases, you isolate yourself by cutting yourself off from the ordinary physical satisfactions of life, which may involve sexual abstinence, fasting, and any number of other things. The idea is you're closing yourself away from ordinary reality, often going off into a literal secluded space, whether in a temple or out in the wild or wherever, and thereby making these communications and enacting what you need to enact. So that is one type of magic. In the Western world, there's been ritual occult magic, often, again, involving all kinds of spirits, entities. The Western world has had, I won't say the misfortune, but maybe I'm thinking that, of having had some of its mentality shaped by Christianity. And Christianity's mentality about these things goes back to the first epistle of John in the New Testament, where it says, try the spirits to see they are of God. If they confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, they are of God. If not, they are of the Antichrist. This has given rise to all sorts of things, one of which is this radical disjuncture between the good spirits and the bad spirits, angels and demons. Is this accurate? Well, I think it's a bit of an oversimplification. Because if you take the analogy of the natural world, there are huge numbers of creatures around us. Insects, things we can't see, things that we'll never see because they're at the bottom of oceans and that kind of thing. Are they good or bad? Well, from a human point of view, the vast majority of them are neither good nor bad. They're living their lives, living what they live on. We've managed to domesticate a few species of animals, which we use for either a nice steak dinner or beasts of burden or our adored pets. But those are very, very few. There are certain species ranging from wild beasts of prey to humanity's eternal enemy, the mosquito, who aren't so beneficial. But even those are quite rare. So we could say that most of the natural world is neutral as far as we're concerned. It doesn't hate us, it doesn't love us, it's minding its own business. Let me then suggest that the unseen worlds are very much the same way. Let's say there are all sorts of beings out there, all sorts of creatures. Some of them may be malevolent. Some of them may be positively beneficent. The majority may be just, going about their own business, trying to live their own lives in whatever realm they live in. Some of them may be beautiful, some of them may be ugly. That doesn't really help us too much. Because if you go back to the analogy of the natural world, there are beautiful flowers that are extremely poisonous. And there are hideously ugly creatures in the sea and on the earth and everywhere else that are completely harmless to us. The actual appearance has very, very little to do with their, shall we say, goodness or badness in relation to us. So we can assume that the unseen worlds are very similar. That much said, it would lead you to exercise a certain amount of caution in exploring these worlds, just as you would if you were exploring the rainforest or any other unknown terrain. Because, again, appearances are deceiving. You could be disturbing something that really could get pretty mad at you. A lot of the Western occult compendium has to do with all of these, like demons, their whole tradition of the demons of King Solomon. King Solomon in the Bible was supposed to be a master of demons. There's a lot of lore about that. And, you look at these demons, well, this demon is good for finding buried treasure or, harming enemies or whatever, but these demons are also rather unreliable. And why shouldn't they be? I mean, if you took the matter face value, there's this demon out there minding his own business, and you've called him up with these rituals and tried to force him to do something. And, maybe he won't like that. Whether he's a good demon or a bad demon. I mean, if somebody broke into your house and started ordering you around, you probably wouldn't be too friendly either. So you have to start thinking about these things in subtle ways. The interaction with the inner realms is always fraught with a certain degree of a danger, but, so is skydiving. If you do want to interact with these forces, you had better keep a good grounding in material reality. And ethically, your nose would better be pretty clean. Because if this sorts of thing, if you have evil motives, they will backfire on you. The Theosophists call this the law of karma. And the law of karma works in a lot of situations. Sometimes with a delayed effect, sometimes with immediate effects. But you better be sure your motives are pretty clean. Why then would you interact with these things? Well, one of the central legends of Western civilization is that of Faust. And the original idea was this Dr. Faustus in Renaissance Germany sold his soul to the devil to gain amazing powers and got to be, get it on with Helen of Troy and so on. Goethe, writing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, transformed it. Faust, at that point, was not a madman after power, but he was a man who desperately sought knowledge, and it was for the purposes of knowledge that he did this, with all that ensued, good and bad. In fact, Oswald Spengler, who wrote a famous book called The Decline of the West in the early 20th century, even went so far as to characterize European humanity as Faustian man. That is, our desire to go further, see things. And our civilization is definitely characterized by that. In the case of certain legends, and even in the case of certain maguses, that was taken into the unseen realms. And the human spirit, particularly in the West, always wants to go further, always wants to push harder and find out what's beyond. Goethe believed that, well, in Goethe's tragedy, Faust is saved. Make of that what you will. So that is one aspect of magic, interacting with these unseen beings of whom we may or may not be able to have some direct experience. Again, this is a matter both of natural affinity and of training. If you have a natural appetite for it, well, you'll probably want to get training. If you have a natural appetite for dancing ballet, it looks like you're kind of good at it when you're young at an early age. Your parents, if they have any sense, will send you to ballet school and you may become a great ballet dancer or not, as the case may be. It's the same with this, or indeed with any human endeavor. But let's go on to the second aspect of magic. And this is, shall we say, a more contemporary version. This idea has been kind of more formulated in the last 175 years. And the man who really kind of brought it into focus was a Frenchman named Eliphas Lévy. That was his pen name. His real name was Alphonse Louis Constant. And he almost became a priest, but decided to ditch it at the last minute. He also had a bit of a run as an anarchist and various other things. But eventually he turned to occult magic. And in 1854 and 55, or is it 55, 56, he published Dogma rituel de la haute magie, Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. And his version of magic was a little different from all of this. I mean, he didn't deny all of this spirit stuff, but he cast it in a very different way. He cast it in terms of what he called the astral light, la lumière astrale, if you're French. And the astral light, well, Shakespeare may have been thinking of it, because Shakespeare was familiar with the occult philosophy of his time. That is unquestionably clear from any number of passages. But at one point he said, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." And astral light is such stuff as dreams are made on. We can see that the world, physical world around us, as we know it, is constructed of something called matter. And what this matter is a bit more mysterious than is normally portrayed. All the same, we have some concept of it and can work with it. The astral light is matter on the level of the psyche. Thoughts, feelings, ideas. The most common image for it worldwide is that of water or the ocean. Speaking of which, because it is completely fluid and it takes the shape of whatever container you put it in. Now, in this particular case, Levi would say, well, the container you put it in is a thought or a magical idea. And if you frame this thought, shall we say concretely, and as vividly as you can, it starts to have a certain kind of power that will eventually enable it to materialize in the physical realm. Because a basic teaching of the occult philosophy, as in Shakespeare and in Eliphas Levi, is that everything exists first in this realm of thought. Everything exists first in this realm of thought before it manifests on earth. I mean, you can see this in really quite routine instances because you're not going to bake a cake unless you have some idea of the cake. Oh, I'd like to bake a cake. What kind of cake? Just a cake. Well, you're never going to get anywhere with that. You have to concretely visualize it. And, with baking a cake, it's a really very straightforward process. But the occult theory is saying that everything manifests this way. And consequently, you can use it in various ways, again, for good or for evil. And so there's the astral light, which can be shaped. That is one force. But let us say there's another force. This is what the Star Wars movies are about. I mean, they call it the Force. In our context, it is the life force. That is to say, vital energy. You may not think this exists. All right, then tell me what the difference is otherwise between a living human being and a corpse. Obviously, when something dies, something goes out of it, and that is this life force. Now, we all have chi, prana. There are endless numbers of names for it around the world because people have discovered it independently and gave it names in their own language, of course. Now, if you take these two things, the astral light and the life force, and combine them, you start to get something very, very powerful. Because you take this image, whatever it is, and you focus energy toward it. The Hawaiian shamans, known as the kahunas, would say you breathe into it. Apparently, well, the Hawaiians call us haules, white people haules, and I have been told that that means breathless ones. And that means because when the Christians came, they didn't put the power of the breath into their prayers. They just sort of, stood there mumbling. How the Hawaiians got converted to Christianity is a story that I can neither go into nor exactly know, but that's another matter. In any case, so you take this, you imbue this with life energy, and it has a greater chance of materializing. Let me use a rather mundane example, one that requires no occult preconceptions whatsoever. Right now, think of a green lion. Green lion, however you picture it. Well, we all know that green lions don't exist. All the same, you can have a picture of a green lion however it shapes itself in your mind. Let's say the idea captures your attention. Let's say you know how to draw a little bit. Suddenly, you created this cartoon character called, that's a green lion. And you kind of you turn it into a little cartoon, you take it to some studio and they like it and they do something with it. And pretty soon you become a billionaire for something that doesn't really exist. In fact, I often wonder about cartoon characters in this context. They do seem to have almost some independent lives of their own. Walt Disney once said that he loved Mickey Mouse more than any woman he'd ever known, which tells you something about him, I suppose. But in any case, this can be manifested. Now, well, if one person can do this, can't a whole group of people do this? Yes. Then it becomes a collective thought form. And because it's gotten so much more energy thrown into it, it has that much more force. And this force can be built up to the point where it can seem quite real and quite powerful, and to have a kind of quasi-independent existence. Let's say there's this thought form that has had an enormous amount of energy put into it over centuries, intense emotional energy directed at it. Well, the fact that this emotional energy is fear and hatred doesn't really make a lot of difference in the long run, because energy is energy. Remember, there's a dark side and a light side of the force. That's why that movie is so popular, because it actually illustrates something. Well, let's say you have a negative thought form and you pour centuries of millions of people's hatred, fear, and aversion into it. Well, it will start to seem real. It might seem to have a kind of quasi-independent existence. Certain people who are vulnerable to it might feel attacked by it. So, presto, what do you have? The devil. Does the devil exist as kind of a theological entity? No, I don't believe so. But I believe that the devil exists as an egregore, that is to say, this collective thought form, shaped, fortunately or not, by the fears and aversions of any number of Christians over the centuries. And obviously you can see the power of this thought form to this day. I mean, people live in fear of this idea, this thing that doesn't really exist as a living being, but exists as this huge collective image with this enormous repository of energy poured into it. And then let me go to the last one, or at least the last one that I will treat this evening. We're talking at some point about the power of intention. Oh, and by the way, a great deal of the positive thinking movement of the last 100 years, particularly in the United States, has a great deal to do with this. In 1910, a man named Wallace D. Wattles published a famous book called The Science of Getting Rich. Well, how do you do it? You visualize the riches coming to you powerfully and vividly. You are even grateful for them in advance of their coming. Does this work? I don't know. I will say that if it's going to work, just some kind of idle wishing is probably not going to do it. And also that probably a great deal of practical action is likely to be required in addition. But anyway, this is the idea behind it. Another famous practitioner of this school is a man named Neville Goddard, said that, well, you should already envisage yourself as already having it. Otherwise, your mind will keep just putting it off into the future and it'll never arrive. People swear by these methods. Is there something to them? Let's put it this way. I would not say there's nothing to them. But let's go to the last aspect that we can deal with. And if you can put this power into ideas, thoughts, well, why can't you do it to physical objects that are already existing? And then we get into this whole realm of talismans, amulets, sacred statues, and everything else, some of which often appear to have quasi-miraculous properties. Sometimes they may seem to be alive. I mean, I'll tell you two stories. One is by a late friend of mine who was a professor of Indian religion. He was visiting a temple in India, and he actually saw this statue bow. That I can tell you about. A girlfriend I had years ago, I went to visit a collection of Tibetan art with her. It was in the De Young Museum in San Francisco, and we got separated. And she said, you know, she stood there and she saw this Buddha or Padmasambhava nod. And she said that to the couple next to her, did you just see that? They said, no. Make of that what you will. I was in another gallery, so I really am not qualified to comment. But sometimes these statues can appear to have living properties. In the Russian Orthodox tradition, there are certain icons which appear to be, or said to be, miracle working. I think the Virgin of Kazan, a city in Russia, is said to be. And then the Russians used to carry the icons into battle before them as kind of talismans. All of these point to a certain kind of sacred force, or at any rate, some kind of force that's been imbued into the object itself. How? By will. By conscious direction of human attention and force. And this, if you go back to the Norse myths, magical swords made this way. There are all sorts of legends about magical swords, but I'm quite sure that whatever effects they had, there were plenty of those Viking swords that had plenty of spells and whatnot woven into them, because people very much believed in that kind of thing. And the examples are endless. The Virgin of Guadalupe, this miraculously painted, we're told, shawl of this Mexican Indian, which kind of turned up, appeared to him, and basically 8 years after the Spaniards conquered Mexico. What is that about? I mean, it exists. It's on display somewhere. I mean, I've seen any number of images of it, as have you. But what is this sort of thing about? So these things have their own power. Some things are more amenable to this kind of use than others. And one, of course, famous example is crystals. The crystalline structure has its own unique properties. Crystals were originally used for healing and are used for healing. And they too apparently can be imbued with certain intentions and certain thoughts. Masaru Emoto, the Japanese researcher, did a number of strange experiments with water and projected thought forms into various glasses of water. And then he analyzed their crystal structures. And the ones that had love, peace, positive energies focused on them had beautiful crystalline structures. Whereas a typical sample of polluted water taken from God knows where, had a completely disorganized, chaotic structure. So again, we're talking about the interface between mind, mental attention, and the physical world. And I believe that just about every civilization has understood the importance of this interrelation. I think one of the main reasons that we live such disjointed lives is that we've just failed to acknowledge this. And this is costing staggering amounts in human costs, as in tens of millions of cases of anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, this kind of denial, this kind of utter kind of isolation of oneself conceptually from the world around us, visible and invisible, I believe is causing a lot of this. Do you know where the word idiot comes from? It comes from the Greek idiotes. And idiotes originally meant a private citizen, an isolated citizen, a man who did not participate in public life. And the ancient Greeks thought this was utterly reprehensible. Later, it came to mean people who are in some way deeply alienated. In the 19th century, psychiatrists were actually called alienists, probably for some reason like this. So the sense of this disjuncture between the physical world that we can kind of see and this inner world that we don't really want to see and keep being told doesn't exist is maybe one of the most fundamental diseases of our society today. It might even manifest in not directly related effects. I have to say the environmental crisis, which you've all heard more about than you wish to hear about, although I suppose we have to hear about it. I believe the environmental crisis is in many ways both obvious and subtle, the result of this isolated mentality of a world that has been kind of deconsecrated, in which the mystery has been lost, or pushed so far, it's not even lost, it's kind of just consciously denied and mocked. And that's the way it is. Do you like that? Well, do you like the effects of what society's like today as a whole? Is it good? Do you think things are going great? Is everybody happy? I'm not going to draw any conclusions for you. In fact, let me conclude this discussion by letting you sit with that and come to your own conclusions. What do you think the effects of the loss of magic on this world are? Thank you. It's been a pleasure.